Hello everyone, and welcome to this special edition of MSBA's Capital Watch program, our review of the 2016 session of the Missouri General Assembly. And here with us to discuss the session and the implications for education are Mike Reed, our Associate Executive Director for Advocacy and our Chief Lobbyist, Mike Winter, Governmental Relations Specialist for MSBA, and Mike Grote, also a Governmental Relations Consultant for MSBA. And gentlemen, thanks a lot for joining us. We appreciate it. Mike Reed, overall, how would you characterize this session of the General Assembly?
Strange year, very strange year. This was not a year where education was at the forefront as we have been in the past. In the past, we've had numerous things such as the transfer bill, et cetera. So we had a number of bills that we watched. There were probably more bills introduced this year than ever have before. However, they were smaller bills, and I say smaller meaning that they went after specific ideas. We didn't have the great big arguments, but we had a number of arguments and questions dealing with education this year.
All right. Mike Grote, an issue our members always care about is funding. Where did we come out on the state budget?
So the state budget, as it has been in previous years, was done much faster this year. So we concluded the budget early enough in the session where the governor was required to sign it prior to the conclusion of session, which he did. House Bill 2002, was signed a few weeks ago and with no withholds. We did receive about a $71 million increase in funding for K-12 education, which is great. And thank you to those legislators, especially Senator Schaefer on the Senate, and of course Tom Flanagan and Scott Fitzpatrick on the House side, for making sure that some of those increased dollars continue to flow towards education. Arguably, we still haven't hit the levels we need to in order to fully fund the formula, but we're working to get there. And hopefully in years future we'll see some more funding for it, K-12 education.
And I think we had a $5 million increase in transportation also in the budget, is that right?
There were a number of small increases that we saw throughout the budget, which I think will be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of fully funding the formula, Mike, we also had legislation related to that as far as changing what's called the state adequacy target. Can you explain that?
Sure, and this is actually a response to some legislation that we've had in previous legislative sessions to try to rebalance that adequacy target. And essentially what it did is it reinstated essentially a 5% cap, and in doing so, it moved that dollar amount down to about $140 million shortfall that we have in the formula, rather than this $500 to $600 million shortfall that we're currently seeing. So I think that's going to take us a year or two to figure out exactly how that's going to flow through the system and what adjustments need to be made, and how all of our schools need to be reacting to those changes as this adequacy target changes impacts them.
And the governor, of course, vetoed that, but the legislature has overridden it, so it's the law.
It is the law, and it has been the case in a number of issues, not just with this one. We've seen a number of gubernatorial vetoes in the last 2 years, and this legislature just continues to say this is our will, this is our desire, and that's exactly what they did with this piece of legislation as well.
Mm-hmm. Mike Reed, as is often the case, toward the end of the session we had what was called an omnibus bill develop, where we had lots of issues that had been discussed during the session kind of converge onto one bill. Is that right?
That's what has happened in the last several years is that the legislators see a piece of legislation moving through and they pile a lot of things on that. This year, the bill that was moving through was the civics education bill that was sponsored by Senator Jeannie Riddle. That bill says that students, when they before they graduate from high school, must take a civics test, a 100-question civics test, like the citizenship test. The way that this bill was changed this year was it includes those questions, can be included in the government and American government and Missouri Constitution as it is taught in the 9th and 10th grades. So all of that will be rolled into one test, and so that was the civics test that was moving through, and a number of pieces of legislation got put on that.
Mm-hmm. Mike Winter, some of the other issues in that bill, I think we had dyslexia screening, we had CPR training, so various things in that bill, right?
Certainly, when you think about where we ended up with a lot of these issues, dyslexia in particular, you'd look at the establishment of a task force to deal with that at the local level. as well as the statewide task force, and then actual screening provisions that were put into some of the omnibus bill as well.
And anti-bullying provision, I think, was in that as well. Is that right?
That is also in the legislation that will have to be addressed at the district level as well.
And another issue that received a lot of attention was suicide prevention. Mike Winter, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. As you would expect, there were very gripping testimony when these bills were heard in both the House and Senate committees, and it did become part of two different bills toward the end of session. Also, districts will have to address policies dealing with suicide prevention within the districts and get those policies in place if they don't have them already.
Another issue, Mike Reed, we wanted to talk about had to do with ethics reform. There was a lot of discussion about that, and we had a few items related to that, I guess, that went through.
As the House, that was the first items on the House agenda was ethics reform. And several bills passed and several bills failed. Among the bills that passed are a 6-month ban on legislators becoming lobbyists at the end of their term. Presently, the law says that into your term you can become a lobbyist immediately. Now there's a 6-month ban at the end of your term for that. You have to wait that long. There's also a provision that changed where campaign finance disclosure reports are filed, and that's important to our members because in the past, campaign finance disclosure reports could be filed at the local level with the county clerk. Now all campaign finance disclosure reports will be filed with the Missouri Ethics Commission, and they'll have to be done online. Things that didn't pass were limits on contributions, limits on the amount that lobbyists can spend on members of the General Assembly, and there were some changes that were in the personal financial disclosure report that also did not pass.
And Mike wrote sometimes issues that don't pass are as important as the ones that do pass, and we had several of those related to some issues we care about. School start date was one of those.
So that's been an issue that we felt we had resolved a number of years ago and continues to come back. There's various organizations throughout the state that are pushing to change school start date. They never seem to reduce the requirements or the things that we have to teach our students in that time period. But fortunately, we were able to push back on a number of those pieces of legislation this session, and none of them did pass. And as you mentioned, sometimes it's just important for a lot of this legislation to go away rather than for it to pass, and that was the scenario here.
Mike Winter, we also had some legislation related to retirement for educators. What happened with that?
There was a retirement provision that was supported by a number of the teacher-related organizations to change the multiplier from 2.5 to 2.55. It became fairly contentious. There were several people in the Senate, 2 senators in particular, who were very opposed to making that modification since it had just been changed 2 years previously. And that issue tended to tie up any retirement bill from moving forward, and that provision did fail in the end and was not adopted.
And we also, gentlemen, had some legislation related to the Missouri State High School Activities Association. One bill in particular that we were following would have allowed home school students to participate in some of those activities, and that did not pass.
That did not pass. There was some discussion, and it passed out of committee. That did not pass. It's an interesting situation. There's actually a division in the homeschool groups. Some want to take part in activities, and some do not. So that has been a contentious situation. Did not pass. Also, there was a bill that would have a study group of the General Assembly look at State High School Activities Association and their relationships with school districts, and that did not pass. However, I look for that to come back next year. I think there's a lot of interest in that.
Mike Reed, speaking of next year, we'll have probably a somewhat different looking General Assembly. Certainly in state-wide offices will have some differences because, of course, this is an election year.
It is.
So
it is. We'll have a new governor. That will change the dynamics to some extent. There's a lot of question on how that's going to happen, what's going to look like. Right now, of course, there is a supermajority of one party in both the House and the Senate. I don't expect that to change, but it's very, very important that our members this year and this summer and fall talk to all of the candidates, discuss with them their ideas on schools, what they like, what they dislike. Have them come to your school in your district. Sit down with the students, sit down with the teachers, sit down with the board, have a discussion, and let them know what happens in Jefferson City affects them at the local level.
All right, so it certainly will be an interesting summer and fall as we head toward the elections and, of course, another legislative session next year. Gentlemen, thanks a lot for all your good work during the legislative session. We appreciate it very much, and thanks for being with us on Capitol Watch. And we also thank you for viewing this special edition of MSBA's Capitol Watch.